Thank you, Monica, and hello to everybody. I hope that there isn't too much background noise. Murphy's Law is that my neighbors over the road seem to be chainsawing a tree down, but we will try and manage as best we can with any noise. Let me know if the quality drops too much. I'm always quite daunted by this prospect of trying to explain how books are costed to a group like this who has a lot of different experiences with books. And I'm very aware of the fact that because I've been involved in publishing for 30 years or more, it's quite hard to remember what people don't know or what people find difficult. So please do just make a note if there's something that I'm saying that is terminology that you don't understand, because I think it works much better if we can be as clear as possible. So I've got a presentation. I'll go through it as quickly as I can, and then we can go back to things when we've been through the presentation for the first time. Just so make a note if there's something that seems obtuse to you, and we'll come back to it. So I'm hoping now I can share my screen. Oh, as I say with one moment, I have a bird in my office, so I'm going to step away for 1 second to let it out. Definitely never a dull moment when working on Zoom from a home office. Right, I hope everybody can see the presentation. Right, so we are going to start with how publishers cost books. And I suppose the first thing to say is that, of course, it works slightly differently depending on the publishing company that you're working with. But the fundamental principles are the same. So there might be tweaks here and there that work in slightly different ways, but really we're dealing with the same set of fundamentals. So if we think about what influences the cost of a book, really what I'd like to say first is that a book is not a generic object. You might say, if we were making a table rather than a book, that it's got a relatively limited set of parameters, but books are enormously diverse. And so we can't, you won't come away from this knowing what a book costs, because each book is different. And so every different piece of the book that is your book that you're thinking about will have an influence on the cost. So remember that from the beginning, that the numbers are going to be illustrative, because there's no answer to what does a book cost. It depends. It's the how long is a piece of string question. So really, elements of the content development, the authoring, I think we often think, particularly in a forum like this, of a one author who writes a book. But in fact, books are generated in many different ways and may have very many different people who are part of that content development. I think particularly of school textbooks, for example, or university textbooks, where the team might be quite a large group of people involved in authoring, photography, illustration. When you get into more specialist subjects, there may be other specialists involved in that content development. Then you've got the skills employed, professional editors, overwriters, learning support material developers. Again, it depends on the book that we're talking about as to what skills are needed to develop that book. And then you've got the production elements. What kind of a book is it? Is it a novel, a textbook, a cookbook? And what are the specifications? So you'll know from a visit to a bookshop that the size of the book can vary hugely. Is it paperback? Is it hardback? All of those things influence the cost. So when we talk about size, we talk about the cover size, but we also talk about the page extent. And all of that is having, so if you're writing, are you writing 10,000 words, 50,000 words, 200,000 words? All of those are possibilities. And obviously every element of the production of the book will be influenced by that size. And then of course, print or electronic. Are we talking about cost of paper? What are the labor costs involved in either print or electronic? There are so many variables. But if we're talking print, then one of the most important things is how many books are you producing? And I'll show you this element of the economies of scale and how that works within book production. If you're talking about the cost of a book in a bookshop, obviously local or imported makes a big difference. And for those of you that work with academic books, you'll know that the range of pricing, depending on where the book comes from, is huge. Then, of course, how do you sell and market the book? So is this direct mail, electronic or otherwise, advertising? Do you need a team of sales reps? What sort of publicity is required? All of those have costs attached to them. And then distribution channels. So I'm glad to know that Johan van Willig is on this call and he can talk to you more about distribution costs, warehousing, delivery of books, and where those books are going to go to. Are you selling from a warehouse into a bookshop that will sell to a retailer? Are you in a market where there's a lot of bad debt? There are all sorts of elements, again, that have different costs attached to them. And then finally, of course, we've got issues of taxes. So VAT on books is a story that comes up often at the moment. All books carry an extra 15%, which is a tax. In some cases, some papers have import duties attached to them. All of those kinds of things are variables within the market that will influence the cost of a book. So you can see that some of them are outside the control of the publisher. Most of them are outside the control of the author, but all have an influence on what the cost of the book will end up with. So, right, let's get into the numbers, and there's going to be a bit of a maths lesson here for people, and I just hope I don't find I've made a mistake in my calculations along the way. So, we've got two main parts to creating a book, two main cost sources just in producing the book. So, origination is the first, and that is all the things that have to happen in order to get the book ready to print or to reproduce in some way. So these are not including print, but they're editing, design, layout, proofreading, indexing, all of those things that get the manuscript to a point where we are ready to print the book. And as I said, that can be a very variable set of activities. Monica alluded to the complexities and the many people involved. So for our calculation, we're going to assume that that origination of the book costs 100,000 Rand. Then we have the print cost, which is using the original file to reproduce print copies. So the printing can only happen after the origination cost. And when we talk about the total cost of the book, what does each book cost? It costs the origination cost, plus the print cost divided by the quantity that you've printed. So that is the fundamentals of a traditional print quote cost. So here we have the numbers on this. So if our origination cost is 100,000 Rand, and we're going to print one copy of a book, so the first line of my table there, let's assume that one copy costs 100 Rand to print it. Then the unit cost of that book is 100,100 Rand. And that's the total cost of the project. That's a single book. So obviously an outrageous amount of money for one book, and there's no margin in that or anything. That's just what the book would cost to print, which in fact is really very similar to when we say it's cheaper to make an ebook. Well, the ebook, the first ebook in effect costs that as well in this example. But if we're talking the economies of scale that we get with printing, then if we decided we'd do 100 books, print 100 books of this, then our origination cost per book goes down to 1,000 Rand. So we are dividing the 100,000 Rand of the origination by the 100 copies that we're going to print. And it comes down to what's now looking quite reasonable compared to the first example of 1,000 Rand for the origination. The print cost would probably come down a bit. So let's say that's 80. So now we've got 1,080 Rand unit cost, and our total project cost is 108,000 Rand. So I hope you're all with me on that. And then we look at what happens if we do 1,000 copies, 2,000 copies, or 5,000 copies. So our origination cost is getting divided by more books each time. And so it goes down dramatically from 100,000 in the first line down to 20 Rand if we did 5,000 copies of that book. Our print cost comes down less dramatically, but still comes down. And so by 5,000 copies on the same illustrative costing, we are now at 50 Rand per copy, very different from that 100,000 that we had in the first line. So our project cost has gone up to 250,000 Rand. So in capital outlay, we're now spending 250,000 Rand, but we have a book with a unit cost of 50 Rand, which is definitely more manageable and looks like a better base cost to start marking up a book for the retail channel. But you can see the effect of quantity on a basic costing from this. Okay, so there are a lot of relative costs here. When we talk production cost, we're talking origination plus print. We've got a royalty percentage. It's not a set amount, and it's considered to be a cost of sale. So the royalty isn't generally paid out as part of the production cost. It's not an upfront cost, but every time you sell a book, you're going to pay a royalty. So from the publishing point of view, the royalty percentage is a cost of sale. So each time there's a sale, there's the cost to the publisher of the royalty. There's a distribution cost, which is the third-party costs for a publisher. And this can vary quite considerably depending on the sort of distribution arrangement that a publisher has. And then, of course, we've got the overhead costs that within a publishing house, you need a team of people to take a book into the market, apart from the people who are involved in the actual origination of the book. So the production cost of the book is going to get our book printed and into the warehouse. But if we need to get the book, obviously we need to get the book out the other end, we need a lot of other infrastructure costs, which generally would be considered as overhead costs. The people who are the sales reps who are going to sell the book, marketing people, this might be slightly old-fashioned these days, office costs. Well, what are those now in the days when many people are working from home? But there are always costs, obviously, of where your team works from. So when we look at how do we look at the costing for a book, I'm going to look at a trade book, so a book that would sell into bookshops. How does it go? How do we move from what the price is that the purchaser in the bookshop is going to pay, and what does the publisher get? Because as Prof. Ngubane said, you know, this is the controversial thing, is that does the publisher get far too much compared to the author? So let's have a look at this. If we've got a book selling at 250 Rand, we've first got to take the government's cut off in terms of tax. So our VAT exclusive price of a 250 Rand book would be 217 Rand. Then we need to take off the discount that publishers in the trade would give to a retailer. So if Melvin buys this book from Bookstorm, we may give Melvin, and this is it's a variable cost. So it's not set in stone, or the Competition Commission would have words to say with us, or more than words probably. But let's say that we offer a retailer a discount off the recommended retail price of 45%. So the price of a book that's going to retail at 250 Rand, the publisher is going to invoice the retailer 119 Rand 57. So that's the income to the publisher. That's what the publisher would consider the sale price of the book. Then we have an author royalty, which I've put at 12.5%, but of course this varies depending on the book again. So that's roughly 15 Rand that we've got there. Then we've got the production cost of the book, which relates back, I think, oh no, we had a 50 Rand production cost on the previous page. So we've got a production cost of 35 Rand per book in this case, worked out as per the previous slide, and a distribution cost of 15%, which is 18 Rand in this case. But again, as I've said, that varies, and Johan will talk no doubt to the things that influence the distribution cost. And so we have a contribution to the publisher's overhead of 51 Rand in this case. But that hasn't taken into consideration any of the overhead costs. So we haven't costed in sales, marketing, office costs, management, editorial oversight over the project or publishing, insurance, anything like that still needs to be paid out of that 51 Rand and 68 cents. And so there's only profit to the publisher if that 51 Rand more than covers the overhead costs. And obviously that's not one book that decides that. It's how the range of books within a publisher fits together.
Hello everyone.
Quantity.
Louise has come back to life. Sorry, Louise.
Okay, I see my internet was unstable.
And you are muted.
Yeah, it's my internet connection. I hope that it will. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Thank you. So if we've got a print quantity, in this case of 5,000 books, Our production cost at 35 Rand a copy would be 175,000 Rand to produce those 5,000 books. Our net price, less the cost that we have to pay to somebody else out of this, which would be the royalty and the distribution in this case, leaves us with 86 Rand 68 out of our sales price. And if we divide our production cost by that 86 Rand, it tells us that it's just over 2,000 copies that we have to sell before we have covered our outlay in terms of production. So it's just a slightly different way of looking at the same figures. But in this case, it's only after 2,000 copies that we will start to have to make money to cover salaries, marketing, all of the other costs that don't go into the direct costing of the book. And you will know that in this market, that's extremely difficult to do. It's very difficult to actually get books in many sectors of the market to go beyond the break-even point. Okay, so there are lots of things to bear in mind, and I'm going to try, I don't know how I'm doing time-wise, let me just remind you of some of the things you need to think about, and then you can ask me to go back and clarify things in the presentation. So remember, all books are different. Quantity makes a huge difference to the unit cost. You need to balance the total, as a publisher, you balance the total project cost with the unit cost of each book, because obviously you need enough cash to produce the books. So the more books you publish, the more stock you have, and the more money you need to produce the book in the first place. But at the same time, if the unit cost is very high, it may be difficult to get to a retail price that makes any sense. So when we're talking ebooks, they don't incur the same print costs, but the origination costs stay exactly the same as for a print book. So if you were doing an ebook only, you would still have the origination cost, and then, but you would save on the print cost. But as we saw with that example, we're working at the first economies of scale, is that the origination cost, if you only sell one book or 5 books, is enormously high, and you could never have a retail price that would cover that really in any different way to how it would be for print. So ebooks aren't necessarily cheaper, is really what I'm trying to say with that. And then don't forget the costs of the rest of the supply chain. And I know that there are going to be more presentations on this, so I suspect you won't be able to forget those costs by the end of the presentations. And then, of course, publishers sometimes don't have sales and marketing infrastructure in-house. They might pay for distribution, sales, and marketing as a higher percentage of sales. So where I put in a distribution at 15%, some people may be paying 25 or 35%, depending on the structure of the services that they are requesting from somebody else. So it's that all books are different is probably the most important thing, is that you need to understand the specifics of a particular project to know which of these variables you're working with. Right, so I think I might have raced through that, but are there points that we need to go back to clarify how some of those things work? So I've either silenced you because the maths is too horrific to manage. I think my internet has dropped briefly again. So,
Louise,
yes.
You've spoken extremely well, and it seems to me simplified a very complex and difficult process for the audience. But probably they're still trying to figure out the maths, and we should have given them a little time to do so. However, what I'd like to do now is to revert to our audience and ask them to formulate questions that they can put to you in, and then you'll be able to go back to some of the points that they find they didn't really understand. If there are any such points, they'll be able to go back to them and you'll be able to further explain. So I'd just like to address the audience now and say thank you, Louise, for an incredibly useful presentation, useful to anyone who's either in the industry or contemplating publishing a book. Writing is the process of inspiration, talent, and research. But if you want all your inspiration, your talent, and your research to reach the audience, in other words, to be read by people, now comes the process of making it readable. And I'm glad that, Louise, you've pointed out that authors and publishers become partners in a long process that has its costs. And I'm glad that you emphasized all the highly skilled and experienced people like editors, illustrators, designers, typesetters, and so on, who are part of this process. Those are the labor costs. But when the book comes back from the printers into the warehouse, or in the case of a self-publisher, into their garage, maybe, another process starts, and that will be the work of our next presenter to explain that to you. However, before we go to our next presenter, I'm sure that there are a number of questions and comments that you have in mind to put to Louise, and I'm now going to open up to those questions. Please raise your hand if you'd like to speak. Are there no questions at all? Well, Louise, it looks like everything you said was so clear that there's no doubts in anybody else's mind. But you said that you wanted to return to some of the points which you felt you hadn't covered adequately. Would you like to do that now?
Sorry, can I just please ask Louise, it's not that there aren't any questions. It's really the numbers that have our mind so boggled up that, we are not even sure what the question looks like right now. I mean, I'm starting to feel like maybe this should have been just your sort of discussion about the numbers the whole time and nothing else, because wow, mathematics, I thought I left it in high school. But this is really grand and interesting, and I do have questions like when you spoke about that, you mentioned that the more you print, sort of the cost of the book becomes less. Am I right, or are the numbers playing tricks on me?
That is absolutely right. The unit cost of the book gets less the more you print. But of course, the total cost of the project increases. So that's always our balancing act. If we had very deep pockets, it's very tempting to say, so if money wasn't an issue for us, we might, and often this happens, publishers are inclined, because publishers believe in the books they take on. So publishers will say, of course we can sell 5,000. We're in fact going to sell 10,000, but let's print 5,000 copies. But then Johan will complain that we now only sell 2,000 and the other 3,000 are sitting in Johan's warehouse at Booksite. And so that happens, you know, so we brought the price down, but now we haven't sold 3,000 of them. So it's the eternal challenge of trying to decide on the right quantity to print, because your numbers look better when you print more, but you've spent more money, you've created more stock. And if that is an unrealistic number, then the money is not going to be recouped on that. But yes, the more you print, the less each book costs.
I see a hand up from Luvuyo Dondolo. Luvuyo, please ask your question or make your comment.
Oh, thank you, Monica, and also the speaker. I think the presentation was informative, but unfortunately, I have a connection problem, so I lost a bulk of what the speaker was addressing or intended to talk to. But the point that I would like to ask, perhaps, is the take, or how can we have strike a balance between pricing and potential readers? When you write a book as an author, you have your own potential readers, and most of the time you consider their financial situation, and then if you put together all the costs involved, you find that the total price of the book is most of the time is over what you thought it will for affordability of a pool of readership. My point is, how can you, because sometimes I find it difficult to strike that balance, because the publisher will guide you and say this is how much it will cost, while on the other side, as an author, you also have your own understanding of the readers, and how can we strike that balance to have a book that will reach the broader audience but still reasonable? Because there are, for instance, some books that will cost 500 or even up to 600, but you find that the content is needed or the text is needed in different fields. So how can we balance that? Thank you.
I think you're asking the question that defines my working life. I think that's really what publishing is about, is trying to answer that question all the time. And there's no easy answer. And I think particularly in a market like ours, it challenges us even more than it does, or maybe it just feels like it does, than in more developed markets with much bigger reading audiences. And so I think it's what we have to work on all the time. I am always looking for new ways that we can do that. For example, in some cases where you may have an audience that can't afford to spend very much, but you know is desperate for a book, is there a way to find a sponsor for that book to bring the cost down? You imagine if you added a sponsorship into that costing, you could take out perhaps 50,000 Rand of that 100,000 Rand, and it would make the book more affordable. Or can you find perhaps a corporate market for some of the books to up your quantity so that you can print the larger quantity? These are the sorts of projects, and without diverging too much, I'm actually, as Monica is also involved, we're working on the master plan for growth in the publishing industry with the DTI and other stakeholders in government. Because if we don't answer these questions, we really run the risk of having very little publishing and writing in South Africa if we don't find a way for books to be more affordable, if we don't find a way to print and sell more quantities of books. So yes, it's the eternal question, and as you can tell, I don't have an easy answer for you.
Are there any more questions or comments that you'd like to ask of Louise?
Hi, Louise, it's Melvin. How are you doing?
Well, thanks, Melvin.
Good. Could you mind going back to that slide where you were talking about the origination? I think, yeah, maybe if we can just tackle that. Yeah, was that the one? Yeah, that other one, the next one.
Oh, the next one.
Yeah. You just want to go through that because obviously it's going to lead into what I'm going to be talking about a bit as well.
Yeah, sure. So shall I just go through those numbers again? Because I know this is, it is a lot to take in, but it's something I work with every single day. So, right, we start at the top. 250 Rand, in this case, the top line, is what Melvin will price this book at in one of his shops. So in his shop, it will say to the customer, this book costs 250 Rand. That's what you need to give us in order to get this book. But that 250 Rand is first made up of 15% of that is VAT. So Melvin is only going to actually be able to keep 217 Rand when he sells this book to a customer. But Melvin has bought the book from the publisher, and Melvin needs a difference between what he buys it for and what he sells it for. And in this case, that's 97 Rand or 98 Rand. That 45% is what the difference between what I'm selling the book to Melvin at and what he's selling it on to the customer, because I'm calculating that off the VAT exclusive price. So Melvin is paying me 120 Rand, 119 Rand 57 for this book that he is selling to the customer at 250 Rand. Of the 119 Rand that I get in as the publisher, I'm paying 15 Rand to the author. I have already paid 35 Rand unit cost to produce that book. And I'm going to pay 18 Rand to Johan van Willig at Booksite in order to distribute the book, to keep it in the warehouse, and then to send that book to Melvin when Melvin orders it. So I have 51 Rand left to cover the costs of running my company, basically, of paying salaries to my staff, of paying sales reps to go to Melvin and tell him that we are publishing this book, of paying somebody to do a marketing campaign that I'm going to put it on social media, that we are doing this book. I'm going to organize author interviews, or I am going to pay some office costs. I'm going to insure my laptop. And that 51 Rand is contributing to those running costs of the business. If there's anything left over, that would be the profit. Melvin, does that?
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. I think that makes it easier for people to understand when you actually put the players in, you know, when you talk about Booksite, when you talk about the bookseller and the customer, it makes it more realistic.
Yeah, like I say, when you work with this all the time, sometimes it's quite hard actually to think of how to give it real context for people who are not involved in that supply chain or only peripherally. Yeah.
They think that whole 250 comes to one of us.
Thank you, Louise.
Can I have one question? Hello?
Yes, please ask your question.
Okay. Whilst you are on that slide, there on author royalty is 12.5%. Is that 12.5% standard across the board, or does it vary from the emerging author to the well-established author? That is to say, maybe it's 12% for the emerging or entering or the first-time author, then possibly maybe it's 15 or 20% for the well-established author, or maybe the 12.5 is it across the board, whether established or emerging? Thank you.
Yes, so there's no such thing as a normal royalty. As with everything that I've said, books are all different, and the agreements between books and publishers and authors are different. So there are many reasons why that royalty might vary. If, for example, if the author is having an auction of their book, and different publishers need to bid on that, which we hear more about in the international market than our own. Part of the bidding might be, how much royalty are you going to pay me? And perhaps the book will go to the publisher who offers the best royalty. But if the author isn't in a position where more than one publisher wants their book, there may be less negotiating. But there are other reasons as well. It depends, again, on the type of book that it is, and the relative costs of the authoring versus the other things that go into the book. So sometimes on books that are very expensive to produce, the publisher may say, the only way I can publish this is to pay a lower royalty. There are also in trade publishing quite often stepped royalties, where you may say, because of how expensive it is to produce, we'll pay this royalty for the first, perhaps until the break-even point, which we said before, and then we will pay a higher royalty when we've covered those production costs. Or we'll pay one royalty up to 5,000 copies sold, and if it becomes a bestseller and we go over that, we'll step the royalty up. But again, there are different norms in different markets, in different segments of the market. And so I think that's why an organization like Anfasa is very good for authors to talk together, so that you can have a realistic idea of, if you're writing an academic book, this is what the range that you might expect. If you're writing a trade book, this is the range you might expect. And that percentage, I wasn't clear in this case, that is a percentage of the publisher's net price. And in South Africa, most publishers pay a net price royalty, which means they pay as a percentage of what they get in from their customers. In other markets, you may have a list price royalty, which in this case, if this was a list price royalty, then the percentage would be taken on the 217 Rand, which is what the customer would pay. But I think that's legally difficult in our market, where we're not allowed to set prices. So there isn't actually an official recommended retail price on which to base a list price royalty. But it used to be like that in our market. And so there may be a few remnants of that kind of royalty system left with some publishers.
Which is the last follow-up question. Now, regarding all that information about the author royalty, do you discuss that with the author before going into the editing and layout and all of this? Or maybe shall I say, do you discuss that with the author, maybe reaching the agreement or signing the agreement on the first time the author submits the manuscript to you? Or do you discuss that after going through the editing between the publisher and the author to say, now your book is publishable, now these are the agreements? Or do you discuss that before or after the editing and all of that stuff? Thank you.
Sorry, Louise, if I may come in here and say, that's a very interesting question. It's not really part of the cost of books in that sense. It's part of the contractual arrangements between author and publisher. We at FASA, that is, also run courses on publishing contracts, in which we explain and talk about issues such as this. I just want to say that royalties are not always, but can definitely be open to negotiation between author and publisher. But I'd want to enable Louise to not to have to answer that particular question, because it belongs to a different area, and we will cover that in our course on publishing contracts, which will take place early in the next year. So please be tuned in and be with us when we do that course, which will certainly look at royalties among other issues arising from publishing contracts. Louise,
Okay,
I
no
would
problem, I'll
really
do
like,
that.
I would really like once again to thank you for everything you've contributed. It's all been perhaps mind-boggling for some, but extremely interesting and extremely important for authors to understand to what extent they're part of an industry, really, and that their talent, their inspiration, and their research comes into the hands of skilled professionals who contribute to it in order to make the book available to the public. As I said earlier, once the books have been written, edited, designed, printed, and land in the publisher's warehouse, or if it's a self-publisher, in the author's garage, that's not the end of the story. And now we're talking about what the booksellers contribute by their link in the book value publishing chain, value chain. So over to you, Melvin Cubware, who's going to talk to us about the cost of selling books.